In this video, we're going to analyze consumer surplus and producer surplus when demand and supply have extreme elasticity values, specifically when price elasticity of demand or supply is infinite or zero. Although perfectly price elastic or inelastic curves are rare in reality, analyzing those extreme cases is a very useful mental exercise. They help us understand the logic of economic surplus more clearly and make it easier to analyze real-world markets that are close to but not exactly at those extremes. I'll use 4 diagrams and go through each case slowly and carefully with you. Let's now start with a case where PED is infinite. Here we have a horizontal demand curve. A perfectly price elastic demand curve shows that consumers are only willing to buy at one specific price, P star, in the case. Any increase in price would reduce quantity demanded to zero. And let's now analyze the consumer surplus. The demand curve shows consumers' maximum willingness to pay. In this case, consumers' willingness to pay is exactly equal to the market price. As a result, there is no difference between willingness to pay and the price paid. Therefore, the consumer surplus is zero. On the diagram, the area under the demand curve is a rectangle. It represents consumers' maximum willingness to pay. This amount is exactly equal to the equilibrium price multiplied by the transaction quantity, which is consumers' total actual payment. So the consumer surplus is indeed zero. And from the previous videos, we know that the shortcut to find consumer surplus is to identify the area below the demand curve and above the price paid by consumers. Since there is no area between the demand curve and the market price here, consumer surplus is again zero. And on the diagram, producer surplus is shown by the triangular area B, below the market price and above the supply. Now, let's consider the case where the PES is infinite. Here we have a horizontal supply curve. This means producers are willing to supply any quantity at a fixed price, P star in this case, but they are not willing to supply at a lower price. And let's analyze producer surplus. The supply curve represents producers' minimum willingness to accept. In this case, the price received by the producer is exactly equal to their minimum willingness to accept for every unit sold. Therefore, the producer surplus is zero. On the diagram, the total revenue is price multiplied by the transaction quantity. It is exactly equal to the area that is under the supply curve. Therefore, producer surplus is indeed zero. And from the previous videos, we know that the producer surplus can be quickly told as the area below the price producers receive and above the supply curve. Here, there is no area between the price producers receive and above the supply curve, so the producer surplus is zero. And on the diagram, I denote consumer surplus as area A, this triangle here, which is below the demand curve and above the price paid by consumers bounded by the transaction quantity. Now, let's move on to the case where PED is zero. And I have drawn here a vertical demand curve, and it means that the quantity demanded is fixed and does not respond to price changes. This often applies to goods that are essential or have no close substitutes. The vertical demand curve also shows consumers' reservation price. Above this price, the demand will collapse entirely to zero as consumers are unable to afford or simply will not buy. So the reservation price is the maximum price that consumers are willing and able to pay for the given quantity Q star. As long as the market price is below PR, consumers will continue to purchase the same quantity of the good. The maximum amount of money that consumers would like to pay is PR times Q star, and the actual payment made by the consumers is the equilibrium price PE times Q star, and the difference between the two would be the consumer surplus, area A. Producer surplus in this case is still the area that is below the market equilibrium price and above the supply curve, this triangular area here, which I denote as B. Finally, let's consider the case where PES is zero. Here we have a vertical supply curve. This means quantity supplied is fixed at Q star and cannot respond to changes in price. This often applies in the short run, for example, when land or productive capacity is fixed. The vertical supply curve represents producer's reservation price, which I denote here as PR. This is the minimum price that producers are willing and able to accept in order to supply the fixed quantity of output. It means that even if the quantity is fixed, producers will still require a minimum acceptable price to make supply worthwhile. The actual amount that producers receive is PE times Q star, this area here, while the minimum amount that producers would accept is PR times Q star, this area here, and the difference between the two gives the producer surplus by definition. So I denote the producer surplus as area B. And the consumer surplus is area A above, which is under the demand curve, and above the price that is paid by consumers bounded by the equilibrium transaction quantity.